Video to look at pivot tables. We're going to do a simple pivot table to see how they work. So the data we're going to use is called the UK sanctions list, which is a list of people against whom there are sanctions. We're going to use this, the UK sanctions list, and I've made a simpler version of it because it's slightly huge. So you'll have this data set, simple 2023 UK sanctions. You can open that in a Google Sheet, and there's about 2,000 rows of people against whom there have been sanctions declared by the UK. I'm going to zoom, go to view, zoom 150%, then view, freeze one row so that that top row remains in place. Then I'm going to click on 1, which selects all of that row, and go Command B and make it bold. And then I might just make that top row a little bit bigger. So this is our data, individuals against whom there have been some kind of sanctions. And what we're going to look at is where they're from, right? So if you want a quick look at what's in all of these columns, you don't want to scroll through the 2,000 rows. The simplest thing is to go to Data, create a filter, and as you know, or you should know at this stage, that will let you filter any of the columns. And then when you click on, for example, nationality, you can see, okay, there's lots of different countries in here. If you click on, we're also going to look at designation, which is, I think, who designated them subject to sanctions. And here you can see it's either the UK or the UN that has made the declaration. So we have all this data. So how do we find, for example, how many people are from Afghanistan? We could just filter, get rid of everything else, and select Afghanistan. And then we can either just count them, or we can select, which is Command, Shift, and down arrow on a Mac. And that will select all of those. And we see the calculator tells us there's 8 there. Or you could just simply drag over that. And you see there are 8 people from Afghanistan. We could look at Algeria. And here there are 29. 30. There are 30 people from Algeria. So we could keep going like that, but it would take a long time and it would be very hard to compare countries, and we would probably make mistakes. So we are going to turn off that filter. Go to Data, Remove Filter, just to be certain that we have all the data here when we create our pivot table. So how do we create the pivot table? We go to Insert. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to rename this. I'm going to double click on this sheet, on this tab, and just call it Data. And then we're going to go to Insert, Pivot Table. And it will ask us if we want to put the pivot table in another sheet or in the one we're already working on. We're going to take another sheet because there's already too much, well, there's already so much stuff here. Let's have a new sheet. And if you want to rename this one, you can. You just double click on it. And you can write, for example, pivot countries. Okay, and so we usually get this table that we can edit, which has rows and columns and values. You can see them here. It also has filters, which is similar to the filter you're familiar with. The easiest way to organize, or reorganize rather, because what we're trying to do is take the original data and get a count for all the countries, all the rows that have Libya, all the rows that have Algeria, all the rows that have Pakistan. So then the data is there, it's just not organized in the way we're interested in. It's organized by individuals, whereas we want it organized by country. So the simplest thing is to say, well, what do I want in the rows? And that's usually fairly straightforward to answer. What we want in the rows is nationalities. Right? We want a row not for each individual, but a row for each country. And there we go, we get all the different countries that appear. The next thing you need to put in is something in values, because it knows that you want a row for Afghanistan, but it doesn't yet know what exactly it's supposed to put in there. So we're going to tell it take what it finds in nationalities and to do a count. Now there's other things you could ask it to do. You could ask, if you had numbers, you could ask for an average or a maximum or to do a sum. But since we simply have text here, how many times does the country Afghanistan appear? We're going to ask for count A, which is count all. You could ask for count, but that only counts numbers, and so you wouldn't get anything. So we look for count A, which is count all. And so now we have a count for each, how many times Canada appears in that column, how many times Central African Republic appears in that column, and so on. Now it also, it always produces totals, which you can get rid of if you don't want them, or you can put them back on. And so there we go. The other thing you're going to want to do very frequently with this is to reorganize it. So we've got a count by country alphabetically. So it starts with Afghanistan, then Algeria, then Armenia. But we probably want to know, well, which country appears the most often. So to do that, you want to sort, which is very like sorting that you're familiar with and on a regular spreadsheet, except it's hidden here. And at the moment it's sorted by nationality, whereas we want it sorted by this column, which is count A. And if you click on this, you'll see you have the option of sorting it by count A. So if you click on that, all of a sudden it's ordering it by the numbers that you have here. And you can ask for it to be ascending, which is it is going from the small numbers to the big numbers, or probably more useful is for it to be descending, so it goes from the big numbers. So we can see which countries appear most frequently. And so now we know that the top 5 countries with sanctions against people are Russia, Libya, Ukraine, Iran, and Mali. So we could, for example, add a filter. So maybe we're only interested in, there's a column called designation that we saw, which basically says, was it the UK or was it the UN? So we could ask for that as a filter, and we could say, we just want to see, and it works exactly like the filters you're familiar with. So we can say, let's show us what happens to the top 5 if we just take those designated by the UK. Okay, so now the top 5 are these, because we're only looking at countries with the designation UK. We could say, give us just the designation UN, and we would have filtered again, and you can see these are the top 5. Now, how did the UK and the UN designations work? I do not know, but that's simply an example of how you might want to filter. Now, to get rid of that filter, you just close it with the little X. The other option you have, although a lot of the time you'll survive simply by using rows and making counts or sums, but we could, for example, instead of filtering by UK and UN, we could add columns for that. So we could say designation source. And so now we're going to remove this total for the moment. And we can see not just what the numbers are, but how they break down. So we know that Belgium has 36, but they're the UK, and they're all, here for example, now there's people in the UK, they're all either UK or UN. But you can see what's happened here. Initially we wanted to just get a count by country. Now we're getting a count by country in the rows, but we're also breaking it down again in between designated by the UK and designated by the UN. Now, a lot of this stuff you can undo almost immediately, so we think, okay, those columns are very interesting, but to be honest, that's too much information. Now I've confused myself, and you just close it with the little cross, and that's the end of that. Okay, so the same, just like we did with the filters. So that tells us, that answers the question. Okay, so that's how you use a pivot table. Remember, we started with the data like this. We were interested in this column. We wanted to count them up by country, but the data isn't organized that way. And so we asked the pivot table to take the same data and just reorganize it. How did we do that? Again, I can undo all of this. We went to rows, we added the nationality so that we had a row for each nationality, and then we added values, which are going to be nationality, and the key point here is what do you want to do with all these different things, and we wanted to count them. So we put in our count. We have an option of filtering. We could filter by gender, for example, and we also have an option of breaking things down by columns, but to be honest, the most useful thing is probably sorting. Again, we went to sort. We don't sort by nationality, we want to sort by count, and we probably want to sort descending. And so that tells us the top 5 or indeed the top 10.